Well, the risk of the finance industry is massive. The United Nations on Drugs and Crime and other credible bodies estimate that there's roughly 2 trillion in illicit capital seeking secrecy from governments every year. For many different reasons. That 2 trillion includes 400 billion a year from the sale of illegal drugs. There's all types of other crimes, pilfering of treasuries, dealing with sanctioned nations, tax evasion, but collectively it's 2 trillion. And absent maintaining an anti-money laundering compliance program that meets all regulatory and other reasonable standards, institutions that move that money, face financial penalties, reputation loss, and if they do it perceived by the regulators because they intentionally failed to maintain an anti-money laundering compliance program, the institution can be charged criminally, the individuals can be charged criminally. And under the worst case scenario, when one of the employees should do that intentionally under the Money Laundering Control Act in the United States, that's a 20-year felony. So, but I have to say that major criminals that I dealt with, and I dealt in the underworld for about 5 years as a money launderer, the greatest majority of the professionals that I came in contact with who handle this type of money, lawyers, bankers, businessmen, financial service providers, they were knowingly involved because bad guys don't want to take risks. They don't want to take the risk of trying to trick an honest banker and then wind up having somebody come after them. So really it's due to a shortcoming of morality more than it is a shortcoming of regulations. We can't regulate morality. Well, fintech companies and companies that offer artificial intelligence, AI, are important tools that all institutions need in their toolbox. But you can have all the technology in the world that identifies red flags, alerting an institution about a possible risk. But if you don't have experienced anti-money laundering compliance staff that holistically understand money laundering systems and methodologies, the data collected through technology has far less value. Crypto and digital currencies, when used for legal transactions, I think they have great promise because they, of course, avoid exchange costs of exchanging currencies. They're speedy. But from the perspective of a money launderer or a bad guy, it has issues. You need to recognize that blockchain technology creates a ledger that verifies details. And unlike a suitcase of cash that moves from one person to another, cryptocurrency, cryptocurrency gives you that ledger. And cryptocurrency was the payment method of choice for dark web and is, as evidenced in famous cases like the Silk Road case where there were internet-based drug rings that were operating. But once the federal government seized the servers of Silk Road and tapped into the blockchain technology, it was a roadmap that identified the criminals. There was an individual who was selling drugs on Silk Road 6 years after tried to claim that the cryptocurrency that he got came from mining crypto. And obviously, the exchanger who he approached with the crypto was able to prove that it didn't come from that, and he immediately called the authorities. The guy wound up going to prison and losing all of his money. So you have to recognize that there's a trail. Then number two, you need to recognize that there's a big fluctuation in crypto. Just take Bitcoin. How many people invest, and when they see the right time, they pull out? Well, that changes the value. Bad guys want to deal in currencies or value that doesn't fluctuate a lot. And one thing that's extremely stable is the US dollar. Plus you have untold number of IPOs that come out claiming to be the next greatest crypto. And all they are Ponzi schemes that lead to people losing all of their money. So there's a lot of reasons that crafty people who are involved in the underworld shy away from it. Well, whether you speak directly to someone to negotiate or you do it through Zoom or a chat room or many of the tactics concerning negotiation apply. When it comes to very important issues, it's hard to remove some type of interchange between individuals. And most of the laundering that occurs, the major important decisions that occur, are carried out through the private client divisions and correspondent divisions of international banks. Those institutions, because they're dealing with accounts that oftentimes are involved in cross-border transactions, require the institution to do enhanced due diligence, and you cannot remove personal contact from doing enhanced due diligence. So yeah, there is less of the face-to-face, but you still can apply many of the rules that I think can aid someone in heightening their ability to negotiate and transact with individuals, no matter what the platform might be, especially when it's important decisions that need to be made. I'd say the first thing and the most important thing is to care enough about your success to do your homework. You need to spend time to learn about, I would say for me as a cop, my target, if you were in sales, your potential market relationship, there isn't anything about the person that you're going to try to win over that you don't want to know. You can learn a lot about them off of LinkedIn and other internet sources. You want to know their passions, their motive, what motivates them, what are their ambitions, their hobbies. You have, once you know that, an opportunity to steer conversation towards social issues and enable yourself to, and I'm not saying this to manipulate people, but when you do, you want to have things in common. And if you know, let's say that your target is really interested in a particular type of thing that doesn't even relate to your business, you're knowing more about that and showing interest in that begins to build a bond with that person. I guess the best example I can give of that, when I was working undercover, I did a lot of intense review concerning one of the people high up in the Medellin cartel that I wanted to approach. He happened to be living in Pasadena, California. He had a high-end jewelry store in downtown LA. He was a collector of Rolls Royces, and he was mad about Impressionist art. He just couldn't get enough information about Impressionist artists and Impressionist art. So I studied about Impressionist different artists. And I also, when he first came to my home, without me saying a word about it, and we walked through the garage, guess what was parked in my garage? A Rolls Royce. Ultimately, I gave him a gift, and it was a gift. This was after a period of time to bless our relationship, was a gold-studded cross that was valued at about $25,000. He was also, despite being a very high-level criminal, very religious. And so it brought us together, it bonded us. And the more you know about the person you want to connect with, the better it's going to be for you to be able to do it. There are other things like verbal and nonverbal signs that people exhibit, and I walk people through what those are. And I basically take people through 9 major tips. And one of the most important, I think, is finding answers with silence and active listening. And my best example of that comes from my personal life. But this is something that I think a salesperson or anybody in business really needs to think about. It was a very sad time for me. My mom was very close to passing, and I was talking to a hospice minister, and he asked me the typical question, "How are you doing?" And I gave him the typical answer, "Oh, I'm fine." And then he simply looked at me with a purposeful pause, kind of inquisitively, and he didn't say anything. And I felt compelled to say more because that silence was getting me a little bit nervous. So the more offer, and that gets people to offer more details, and that's the more you'll learn. Maintain focused eye contact. Silence after your target's general response will cause them to feel awkward and compelled to deliver details. And he learned a lot more about how I was really feeling, which wasn't really well. My first answer was deceptive. Well, I guess for lack of a better way of saying it, preparation is in my DNA. I'm not going to be outworked. I may be outsmarted, but I'll never be outworked. And the degree of preparation that I went through is, I can explain from my first long-term undercover operation that the book and the movie The Infiltrator is about. But I had a home in Key Biscayne. I needed to live in Miami because Miami is the crossroads of the international drug trade. And many very important drug traffickers who I came to know would go through Miami or even lived in Miami. Before I met them for a particular meeting, knowing full well what it is that I wanted to accomplish, I would actually sit for hours, day after day, probably 2-3 days in a row before the meeting. In the same room where I knew that this critical meeting would occur, I would sit in the seat that I knew that I would be sitting in, and I would go through my mind in what it is that I would say, knowing full well that the person I was going to be dealing with could twist the conversation or topic in different directions. And I gave thought to every possible way that that person might respond and how I could then shift it back in the direction that I wanted. And when the meeting finally occurred, for me, it was like watching a rerun on television. I had already expected exactly how it went. It put me so much at ease because, you know, it's a very nervous situation that you're sitting in. There's recorders that are hidden in the room. There are all types of stresses that you're under, and anything and everything that you can do to make yourself comfortable and familiar with the setting during that very stressful meeting is going to put you more at ease, and it's going to give you a greater possibility for having success. And with respect to stress, you know, I had to recognize that I was going to get a lot less sleep than I would in my normal life. I mean, when you're going to run 2 lives within one body, you're obviously going to have less sleep. When the bad guys were done with me at about midnight or 1 in the morning, you know, I had to take what just had occurred over the last 5 or 6 hours and at least make notes and possibly process tapes that I had recorded on and make reports. And so in order to deal with that, there are 2 things that my handlers always made it very, very obvious that one needed to do. Obviously, you need to eat right, but you need to maintain a rigorous exercise program. I was a runner, and I found time to run every single day. And unless you do those types of things to really prepare to keep your body in the best possible shape you can, going through the types of stress that I went through is something that you're not going to be able to do very easily. You know, as far as teamwork goes, some people don't recognize that at the height of the operation, there were 250 people behind the scenes working to keep me alive, me and my partner alive, other undercover agents that were doing investigative work, analysts, prosecutors, administrative staff. You need to recognize that you have to build a team. And in order to build a team, just like you would do in business, you really need a Bible from which everybody operates, a business plan. And for the undercover operation, it was an operational plan. But you need to pre-think out every possible issue, from identifying your targets, your goals, identifying the resources you're going to need, determining who's going to be on the team, spelling out what each person is going to be doing, setting up a method of periodic review to determine whether you are advancing towards your goals, establishing management oversight. These are all things that everybody on the team needs to know. And that's the only way that you can get everybody pulling in the same direction. There should be no confusion on any team member about what's being expected of them, where we want to go as a team, and how we're going to get there. I decided after being approached to write a second book. You know, after the experience of The Infiltrator was my first long-term undercover assignment. After that, I did another 2.5 years. I had to create a whole new pseudonym, a whole new background, companies, and I was enlisted to become operating within the Cali cartel. Which was a little risky because the Cali cartel is only a couple of 100 miles away from where the Medellin cartel was headquartered. But I was also asked to, in that undercover assignment, to infiltrate corrupt businessmen and bankers in Panama who were involved in laundering. So I wrote a book, The Betrayal, about that 2.5-year experience, which is going to be published in the spring of 2022, not just in North America, but in the UK and in other European countries. And that the movie rights for that book have been optioned by a major studio. And we're working with the same team members that worked on the Infiltrator film to try to develop those film rights into an actual production. You know, the book is called The Betrayal because, unfortunately, one of the officers who was assigned to work with me undercover, unbeknownst to me, was on the take. And he outed me to leaders of the Cali cartel. And I came within a very few minutes of being killed. And so thus The Betrayal. And I think it's a pretty exciting story, and I'm anxious to see to share it with the public in the spring.